Hi everyone, welcome to episode 2 of Richard and I's conversation about complexity, leadership, scaling tech companies. We decided to try and constrain the conversation this time a little bit to one particular topic, which is complexity versus complicated, or complex versus complicated. They sound very similar, but there are some quite important differences, and we're going to dig into those today. So let me just invite Richard on. Welcome, Richard. Do you want to give a quick intro like last time?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. It's a pleasure to be back. So Richard Hughes-Jones, I'm an executive coach working kind of field of business building and leadership in the early stage tech, high growth space primarily, and just really interested in bringing a lot of this thinking certainly into the leadership space as well. So obviously, aligning that with more the tech side as well. So yeah, that's me.
Great. I forgot to mention in the intro, actually, if anyone's following along on Twitter or YouTube Live, we're using a platform called StreamYard. So if you type your questions in, we should, fingers crossed, see them. So let's just frame the conversation, shall we? So I put a little slide together earlier, which I'll just share now. So what's the difference between complex and complicated? So we'll dig into Kinefin, which is a good source of where all this stuff comes from, with some other domains that are closely related. But for me, complex, the difference between complex and complicated, if I had to pin it down to one sentence, is that complicated is linear and complex is nonlinear. So on the complicated side, things are reducible. You can pull them apart, put them back together again. And in the complex side, you have to think about whole systems, because cause and effect is not directly related. So that's where we are. And then I've just thrown a couple of, several opposing viewpoints. So one of the kind of new voices I've come across in this space is a guy called Tyson Yunkaporta, who's written a fantastic book called Sand Talk. So I've been listening to a few of his podcasts, and I'm halfway through the book. The framing that he uses, there are a couple of his framings in here. So, complicated is about the entities. You can reduce a system to the entities that make up the system. And complex is much more about the connections. So, as we talked about last time in Metcalfe's law, if we're talking about a business, the entities are the people, and there's a number of them. And then the connections between those people are, that number factorial. So, much more rich. So connections versus entities. And then the other framing that Tyson has, which I really like, is that, a complicated system has to be maintained, whereas a complex system is self-sustaining and is running off its own energy. And I think this is actually a really interesting framing for growing tech companies, right? You're moving from something that has to be continually tinkered with to something as a leader that you can step back from, and enough parts of it will run on their own. So I'll throw that over the fence to you, Richard, now, and let's just sort of dig into those couple of things.
Yeah, sure. So, and sorry, Ben, I was just going to add, to frame the conversation, I think if we riff on this, because obviously of what this difference is and why it's important, and we framed this conversation in the context of why tech leaders should care. So I know the plan is to kind of bring the conversation back round into some more kind of practical stuff around why tech leaders should care towards the end of the conversation.
Plan is a very generous term for what we've done setting this up, but let's go with that. Yeah, let's say we planned it.
Oh yeah, well, no, loose plan, but that's all good. Yeah, I mean, perhaps if I could just go back to where I come from on this, in terms of the complicated, complex. I think fundamentally, human beings and businesses and business leaders, we're wired to see the world through a complicated lens. We like order. We like to be able to structure things. We like to be able to categorize things.
Explanations. Everyone's always after an explanation.
Exactly. Cause and effect. You know, if this happens, that happens, and that kind of, well, that linear thinking. And that's, you know, that's evolutionary. It's psychological. It helps us make sense of the world. It eases the cognitive load, and it helps us get through everyday life. But the reality is we live in a complex world, which, as you've started to outline there, and gosh, we could riff on all the reasons for that for hours. Operating in a complex world requires kind of different ways of thinking and different ways of doing and acting. So I think, you know, first of all, in the first instance, which I guess was the reason for having this conversation, the most helpful thing is to just help unpack what the difference is. I had an exchange on Twitter with someone the other day. You know, once you get your head around that difference between complicated and complex, you start seeing it all around you. And I don't know about you, but I'm really conscious of the language that I use, because the two words are used so interchangeably, and actually they, you know, they are different things. So yeah, that's, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just my kind of, it's my baseline take on why this is so important.
Yeah. And just to kind of pick up on that point, you know, all of our education systems, you know, our literature, you know, I come from a tech background predominantly, you know, all of our, I mean, it's changing slightly now, I suppose, but, you know, all of the traditional kind of tools and methods that we use are all about, you know, driving out variability and building stability and, you know, building stable systems. And, you know, that, you know, you can have a complex system that contains complicated or clear, and we'll go into what the difference between complicated and clear is, you know, through the lens of the Cynefin framework shortly. But, you know, you can have complicated and clear aspects of a complex system. And that's the entities, right? The entities can be constrained. So even, you know, even people, although they're inherently extremely complex, you know, if you give people SOPs to follow, you know, those things can be, you know, diagrammed out into a flow chart and made clear or complicated. But the interactions between those things are always not chaotic, that's a different thing altogether, are always complex, right? You've always got second, third, fourth order effects. You've always got a changing environment. And it's that causes this complexity. So, I mean, you know, an example from one of my hobbies, you know, riding a motorbike. Right? I ride a motorbike on track, and it's a complex adaptive system. Every control input you changes the bike in a dynamic way. So, you know, you're going around a corner, mid-corner, you roll off the throttle slightly. You're not just slowing down, you're also changing the suspension geometry. You're actually tightening up your turn, right? And I have a certain sense of how all that works. Somebody who is better than me would be doing that and going at exactly the same speed on the same bike, and they would be in a completely clear domain, right? They would not be bothered or worried at all. They would be in complete control. If I tried to ride at their speed, I would be in a chaotic or complex domain because I would be beyond my level of comfort. So it's the same system, but in a different context. It moves from domains. That was a bit of a rant. Sorry, I went.
No, it was a good example, because perhaps so just to be really to exemplify what we mean, a motorbike, a high performance motorbike, any bike is a good example of the bike itself is complicated. You can take that bike, a good mechanic can strip it back to all its individual pieces. Even another mechanic could come along with the manuals and the diagrams and piece that bike together. It would be to all intents and purposes exactly the same.
Yep.
the interesting thing is then when you get on that bike, as you explained, and also when you put 10 bikes on a track together.
Oh yeah, that all
Then
gets very
suddenly,
fun.
yeah, you've moved into this realm of complexity, because
Yep.
there's so many things going on. Not least that each individual rider is a human being and has free will, and is, as well as what the bike's doing mechanically and gravitationally and all those things, the human being is also thinking and acting. So I think it's a really good example. And I think, to bring that back to a business, a business is not an individual entity that you can break down into its individual components. Yeah, you can draw nice organizational charts and give people roles and responsibilities, but and pull together the IT infrastructure and everything. But when you put all those things together, you are very firmly into the realms of complexity and all things that go with it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, you use things like Wardley mapping or other kind of frameworks to try and transplant business process modeling notation, all these things. You can transplant in some way. You can transplant things that have worked elsewhere. You can transplant those into a part of your business, and you can make, for example, a CI pipeline, right? You can use the same tools. You can build a CI pipeline. So you can take complicated best practice, designed by experts that's worked somewhere else, but you're never going to have the same thing, right? It's going to be, you can use those ideas and you can use parts of those solutions, but you're never going to get something that you can just take out of a box, take a motorcycle that's been disassembled and reassemble it in your business and have the same motorcycle. It just doesn't work. People think it does. People want to take some out of the box solution because it's comfortable and it's attractive to be told, and maybe not in this conversation, but we could talk about, the consultancy game. It's comfortable to be told we have the answer, we can give you the answer. But in reality, even if you put all of those bits that comprise the answer into somewhere else, the answer is not the same, right? You have to build your answer in context.
Yeah. Well, I'm always happy to riff on the consultancy game because I was one for 10 years, and boy, have my attitudes changed. So I wonder on that, because there's some real good stuff you said in that. I mean, I scribbled down before we started this kind of, because I did want to make sure, for the benefit of people watching, that we address this question of why tech high growth leaders should care about this difference. And so I wonder if it's worth, just cantering over those points, and then we can just have a discussion about them. How does that sound?
Yeah, do it. I've monologued enough. Go for it.
Okay. I mean, so the three things I wrote down are, firstly, that building a business, or the art of business building, is not complicated, it's complex. Leadership is not complicated, it's complex. And people are definitely not complicated, they are complex. So, and then just to, to kind of break each of those down. One of the challenges I see, and you touched on it a couple of minutes ago, is this kind of drive to make business building complicated. And don't get me wrong, you've touched on it earlier. There are parts of business building that are complicated. If you're thinking about it in Kinefin framework terms, there's parts of it that are simple. Putting HR policies and procedures in place. They are things that you have to do. You're in the world of best practice. There's ways to do it. You could argue, and I'm happy to, people do please drop their comments in, but you could argue that designing and putting in place a sales process is complicated. How people act within it gets a bit more nuanced, but designing and putting those things in place, if you get, they say about about the complicated space, it's the domain of experts. You know, if you get enough people in the room, you can solve the problem.
So just one extra little point on that. It is, except that the quicker the world moves, the faster expertise is out of date.
Yeah.
And if you don't realize that your expertise is out of date, like, you know, if you were a marketing expert 5 years ago and you haven't learned anything since, you're definitely not an expert in today's world. And I think there's increasingly more and more of those domains that you know, expertise via time served, you know, longest bum on seat. You know, those people who've been promoted into leadership positions start to feel very vulnerable and very fragile because they were experts before. And, you know, leadership is really about acknowledging, or certainly for me as a tech leader, whenever I'm in a tech leadership position, the very first thing I'm going to do is try and find people with more current knowledge than me.
Yeah, so this is fascinating, because I think, and you've moved it on to the leadership point, and, you know, to be a bit controversial, I do have this strong sense that the Twitter sphere and the like is setting people up for a complicated world in terms of the advice. You know, we're talking about, it's the world of playbooks and 5-step plans, and, you know, if you do these things, you will be successful. That is very much in the complicated world. And because business building and leadership is complex, I have to ask myself whether we are, as a kind of broad industry, really helping leaders, or, you know, equipping them with the best tools and opportunities to be successful. I think because of what we talked about right at the start, in the complicated space, things are understandable, they make sense, they're ordered, so we like it, it's comfortable. Business building is, it's uncomfortable. Yeah. And I know we've had a few comments around, you know, resilience and anti-fragility and all this sort of stuff, super important stuff. If you develop people for a complicated world, you really are setting them up to not always fail, but, you know, you're only ever going to get so far. So I really do feel like this helping people move from complicated to complex kind of thinking and being ways of holding complexity is you know, real kind of bit of a sort of new frontier in that sense. Obviously I'm biased. I don't know, what do you think to all that?
Yeah, so yes, so the system is and will always remain complex. So from the military, like, I've spent, you know, the last 5 years trying to contextualize things that I learned without realizing I'd learned in the military for businesses. And I'm you know, doing a course at the moment. You know, a lot of research has gone into that, and I believe that there's a means of having your cake and eating it as well. So let me give you an example of what I think is very, very good practice. I'm not going to say best practice because it's not really correct, but so one of the inputs into my course, I'm breaking down a book called Shape Up by Basecamp. Right, this is their kind of remote operations, you know, how they work with their team. This is their, you know, their best practice SOPs, if you like. And I think that they've arrived at a very, very sensible design for how they structure work. So they've got, you know, they have bets, they have, you know, 6 weeks cycles, and they have this very, it's a real system of constraint, right? There's a real constrained way they work. This is how we do it here. Okay. Now, that really rings true. I mean, and also, I mean, we'll probably don't have time today, but the structure of that is very, very similar to how the military structures orders and operations. And I think there's a very good reason for that. I'm not going to go into that because it will sort of detract from what we're talking about here. But what I think that lets you do is it lets you channel that complexity in a way, right? If you have a system and a structure that puts the constraints in the right place, the bits where the constraints aren't is the bits where you can have, you know, complexity and creativity, and you can allow that, almost energy to come into the system, because you do need complexity, right? If you're pretending that you don't have complexity and everything's like you do what everyone just does what they're told, the system will die. And system can be anything from an ecosystem to a business. So I think that there is, and another good example would be team topologies. There's some fantastic, very simple way of shaping thought and communication in there that put that firmly into complicated or clear. But when you choose where you put your complexity and where you put your complicated constraints, I think that gives you, I think that's where people have to go to, right? There's I don't know, I'm going to stop talking now, but
you were making me Patrick O'Shaughnessy, who does the Invest Like the Best podcast, sent a fantastic link out on Twitter the other day to an article written, but I think it was written by, obviously it must have been written by someone from engineering, saying, and the title of the article was "Why CEOs Are Failing Software Engineers," and it's really good. I'll share it. And that article talks about different types of management, but the two it focuses on are what the writer calls business management and creative management. And it just used that sort of knowing what I know about Basecamp as well. Business management is Taylorism.
Yep.
It's Fordism. It's complicated. It's firmly in the complicated domain, and it's fine when you've got very established business models. You can kind of train people up. You can put them at the right place in the system, and they will produce, and you end up with the output. Then the article talks about creative management, which is fundamentally about is shifting into that complex space.
Right.
How do you empower teams to manage in a complex space? And I was kind of thinking, I think people, I don't know, wonder if there's this sense that if something's complicated, then you can come up with a plan to navigate it, whereas if something's complex,
well, yeah, it's so one of the let me pull the slides up again. So one of the line items I've got here is explorers versus experts, right?
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to what you're talking about. It's if you've got a complicated sort of business process, you can measure it, right? If you've got a sales funnel, you can stick analytics on it and tweak it and make it more efficient. But interestingly, even Basecamp, even in ShapeUp, they have a recognition in there that, let me just so another slide here. They have a recognition in there that you need to start with chaos, right? So their R&D process is all about allowing the maximum kind of chaos and complexity to swirl around with very little process. And it's not until you get to the point where, and time is really the evolutionary access from audio mapping here as well. It's not until you allow that to swirl a bit that you can extract some clarity, and it's not until you've got some clarity that you can get some consistency. But so many tech companies just try and go straight from zero to scale.
Okay.
I've worked in plenty of those, and they're just a stress fest. They're not pleasant places to be. There is no recognition of, you're in complete chaos all the time, or at least complexity, more like chaos all the time. And managers or leaders that don't understand why are continually hammering more and more kind of complicated tools. And that's a massive failing in technology leadership all the time. Is you get a team that's in crisis or chaos, and somebody comes in and is like, oh yeah, well, in the big company that I used to work at, we just used Jira and everything was fine, and completely ignoring the fact or not recognizing the fact that it was a vastly different context.
Interesting. It reminds me, it's the Andy Grove in only the paranoid survive. Let chaos reign, then reign chaos in.
Yes.
And that is a super.
And that's really. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but there's something about OKRs that, that for me is the essence of OKRs, right? It's a framework to enable massive, quick change to be affected when it's needed. It's not a way to linearly break down work into quarter chunks that have nice metrics and try and turn a system into a complicated system from what is inherently a complex system. And that's how it's being used. Yeah.
And this is fascinating from a leadership perspective, because there is a tipping point, and this has come up in coaching conversations with clients, where you can have too much chaos.
Oh yeah, totally.
You have to shift, and this is back to the fact that there aren't playbooks for this. It's hard. There is no escaping the fact that it is hard. As a leader, knowing how much to let chaos reign and when to pull chaos back in, I think is it's one of the hardest things.
Yeah. I was having a conversation the other week, and we sort of touched on this a little bit. So here's the problem, right? If you're a company that's promoting leadership from within, right? By necessity, if you're a growing, scaling company, right, everyone is completely focused on making that company a success, right? N equals 1. If you've got somebody who, your people are not hopping around and seeing lots of different contexts, right? So you've got that great focus, and people build fantastic cultures, just building a really single-minded focus on making this particular company successful, which is great. But the problem is that where do you get your pattern matching and your knowing when to rein in chaos from, if you've only done it in one place and you've been there for 5-10 years and you've made that incredibly successful? And this is also the problem with transplanting leadership in from somewhere else, right? Unless, hopefully most mature leaders will realize that, what works then might not work now. There's that, forget the philosopher, I think I quoted this last time, but no man steps in the same river twice, because it's not the same river and he's not the same man.
Oh, you're Heraclitus. I looked it up afterwards.
Did you? Oh, well done for remembering.
Yeah. Something, well, probably pronounced it wrong, but something like that.
Yeah. So I just noticed the time. We literally could go on for hours.
Yeah, we could.
We've got 2 minutes left. So is there anything that we should sort of wrap up with? Any questions from the audience? I can see that we've had one from Matthew. Anyone else who's following along at the moment wants to ask us anything that we can tackle, probably post talk, I should think. But yeah, Richard, any closing comments?
So I've just got, in the interests of this whole thing being called navigating complexity, this thing we've talked about, the fact that, if we think and operate in a complicated space, we get this felt sense that we've got control and we can plan. Our pushback on that would be, well, actually, that's not necessarily the case, because you're operating in a complex space, but there are ways that you can navigate complexity. I scribbled 6 down, so I'm just going to say them super quick. I'll tweet them out after this. The ones I wrote down was, first of all, this is the hardest one, I think. You have to try and stop fighting it and recognize that you are in an inherently complex environment. We've talked about using sense-making tools rather than playbooks. So things like Kinefin versus your 5-step frameworks. The habits of mind stuff, there's some really good, Jennifer Garvey-Berger's great on this. Sonia Bligno did a session on the map camp thing you did a couple of
Oh
weeks
yeah,
ago.
that was fantastic. I watched that afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, so things like asking different questions, getting different perspectives, the whole diversity debate.
Very far from alpha male leadership, isn't it? The traditional kind of strong
very
leadership
far.
sense.
Fundamentally, if once you move out of the complicated expert space, you're in a space where no single person or even necessarily group of people can know all the answers.
Yeah.
That's really tricky from a leadership perspective because of some of the psychologies that go with people looking up to confident leaders and all the rest of it. But
yeah,
again,
great phrase that we use often in red team thinking training is that none of us is smarter than all of us, which is the whole point of having a system like red team thinking.
Yeah. And getting those, getting people from different backgrounds, genders, race, geographies, specialisms around the table. I'm really just more and more convinced that this is such a helpful way of navigating complexity. And the other habit of mine that someone like Jennifer talks about is seeing the system. So it links back to all the things we've been talking about: nodes, nodes, connections, interdependencies, and being able to get up on the balcony and see those. Quickly, because I know we're on time, safe to fail experiments, ways of trying things that it doesn't matter if they don't work. You're not betting the business on them.
Yeah.
Sort of optionality, again,
limit your downside without limiting your upside. Design the experiments like that.
Exactly. So I think that links quite closely to the previous point. Mm-hmm. And finally, I just wrote down, remember, it's hard. It's not supposed to be simple. If someone's selling you a simple solution, please think twice.
Yeah. Well, and also, stepping away from perfectionism. I mean, this is something that I'm, hugely guilty of in my personal life, is wanting to get everything perfect, wanting to get everything right. And, I think operating in complexity means that you need to knock that on the head. Like, you need to take a plan that's good enough, execute it and iterate, rather than, waste any time at all trying to find a perfect plan.
Yeah. I think Sonia said in her talk, embrace the messiness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whilst, the flip side of all of that is, from a leadership perspective, is you do have to wrap some boundaries, some sense of direction and certainty, because when you're taking 50, 100 plus people on a journey, because of human psychology, there has to be some sense of clarity.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're starting the journey with 50 and ending the journey with 100, without some clarity, that is not going to end well.
Yeah. It's not hard. It's not easy, hard, but great. Yeah. Great conversation. We're doing another one.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we could we could keep going just 24/7. Yeah. Let's do another one. We'll, so for anyone who's still with us, hit us up with anything you want us to dig into more.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
That can be within the bounds of this conversation, or anything else that you've sort of, anything else that's come up for you afterwards. Just hit us up and we'll do another one next week.
Superb. Thanks, Ben.
Great stuff. Thank you, Richard. Bye, everyone.
See ya.